All right, so monitoring CloudStack. Who's monitoring their stuff? Hands up. Nobody? Really? Come on, guys.
We guys.
I'm kidding. Lots of hands in the air. All right, that's good. I was tasked with researching this subject a bit a while ago, quite a while ago, and yeah, came up with a few conclusions, and I'm basically here to speak to you about them. So obviously, monitoring is important. Otherwise, you don't really know in which state your stuff is in. Is the cat dead or alive, to use Schrodinger's cat metaphor? And yeah, that's why we need proper monitoring and alerting to see what is going on in your deployment, in your infrastructure. In terms of solutions, what you can use, there is really a vast choice out there. Luckily, you can use all sorts of open source or commercial products like SolarWinds or Ubersmith, but of course we have some really good open source solutions for monitoring not only CloudStack but generally all the stuff around it as well. So I'm looking at Zabbix, Prometheus. There is of course Nagios and CheckMK, which is very popular, and of course there's a plethora of other stuff as well. A lot of these things have been around for a long time now, like Nagios, who's probably older than me, and some other ones. But of course, there are new kids on the block, such as Prometheus and InfluxDB and some other stuff, although they are not strictly about monitoring. Well, Prometheus kind of is, but InfluxDB is not. So having gone through most of this, my own conclusion was that we should use Zabbix, little reference to Baz Luhrmann's song there. So why I came up with this conclusion, having gone through a lot of this other stuff, is that, well, it's free, it's readily available, it's easy to install on most platforms. It's just a click or a yum install or apt-get install away. It's a great combo of both old and new, and by that I mean support for monitoring via all sorts of methods. So you can do just basic checks like is that port open, is that SNMP alright, and so on and so forth. So not only that, it covers the old school stuff like we used to do it 10-15 years ago and more, but also has support for a lot of this new stuff that I mentioned, like Prometheus, so it can read Prometheus exported data and can also integrate with InfluxDB, and more than that, I didn't manage to put in there. So besides the great monitoring, it also supports reporting as well, so it will get in touch with you via all sorts of, like a couple dozen way of getting through you, including what's more popular now, like Slack or Microsoft Teams, IRC of course, and email, and of course you have dashboards and whatnot if you want to just put something on a TV on a screen, if you still do that kind of thing. Another really nice thing about it is that not only it alerts you, but you also get for most of the stuff nice graphs. You can see historical trends, and you can kind of it helps you make an image in your mind of what's going on there with that service and so on. It's extremely flexible. You can monitor loads of stuff with it. It's got this templates. It's a concept that they use, predefined checks and triggers and so on for monitoring services, and then you can of course add your own. You can either create templates or you can add custom checks, which it's a way of basically hooking bash scripts into the system and get out of it values and of course graph them and so on. Nice UI. There's an API available as well. So coming from Nagios, for example, I remember I had to deal with loads of config files, add them and so on, but of course this was many years ago. And of course, being an open source project and successful and on the market for so long, you can find so much documentation, tutorials, videos. YouTube is full of stuff, for example. So most of the questions you might have, somebody already probably answered that for you. Going further, so nowadays we live in this cloud native world. Everybody's thinking of the sexy things, Kubernetes, containerization, JSON, automation, and so on. But let's not forget about the metal that everything runs on. So that's one thing nice about Zabbix, that it supports monitoring everything, starting from the power distribution units, going through storage units to switches and so on. So let's not forget about this, all the infrastructure that actually hold our cloud together. So what should we be monitoring? Well, starting from the ground up, as I said, and this is slightly misaligned here, probably I would start, if I were to run my own data hall or something, I would start with the power distribution. Most of the PDUs support, can connect to a network and export all sorts of data via SNMP. Then of course you have your network gear, your routers and switches, and this is just a sample graph from one of our Mellanox switches indicating some traffic rates here. Of course, you can have all sorts of triggers connected to these values. Should it go too high or too low, or should there be lack of data as well? Moving sort of up the stack, of course, the next very important bit are the storage platforms. So maybe you're using something open source like FreeNAS or something like a QNAP appliance. You may want to, of course, keep an eye on that, see how your disk usage fluctuates during a period of time, and of course you can do that as well. This is another sample from actually a QNAP in our lab, and it's showing what is showing the free size of a certain volume, so it's at 20%. Just an example. Moving on, right, hypervisors. Of course, one of the more important, well, the more important, they're all important, but these ones are so close to they are getting closer to our workloads, which are inside the VMs, right? So they are very important. Typically, you'd be running KVM, VMware, or Zen server. In this case, I have a graph here with a CPU utilization of a KVM box. Of course, it's really easy to keep track of that, and you can do the monitoring via SNMP, or if it's a Linux hypervisor, the KVM hypervisor, you can just install the Zabbix Linux agent there and export like a lot of metrics and have monitoring for whatever you want. So in this graph, it's showing CPU utilization, and I'm not sure if it's visible from the back. There's a trigger here. If the CPU utilization goes over 90, it will trigger an alert that you're gonna get via whatever you've configured there, email or Slack or whatnot. So there are all sorts of ways of monitoring this. For VMware, the support is also very good. Zabbix has some really nice templates for that, and auto discovery of all sorts of features, metrics, including number of VMs, and probably can go even further and automate adding those VMs to monitoring as well. I mean, more than just them being up or down. What else is there? So we've talked about the hypervisors. We have our database service that we need to run CloudStack, of course. Sometimes this service runs on the same CloudStack management server. Sometimes it's on a different box. But no matter where it runs, it's critical to your CloudStack installation. So this needs to be very available, and you need to keep an eye on the performance. We have a sample graph here that's looking at query selects per second, which is fine in this case, and I've put another screenshot here showing when CloudStack, when Zabbix managed to find that the slave IO thread is not running on the secondary database server. So basically that means your replication is broken, and you need to see why it's broken and fix it, because that could leave you exposed to all sorts of problems. So you can monitor MySQL via SNMP, but really you want to install the Zabbix Linux agent, because it will connect to the MySQL server and extract from there a lot of data. Right, so as I said, replication is very important, and you will need to keep that. If you're using Galera or something else, I'm pretty sure there's support for that as well, one way or another. Okay, getting closer to CloudStack itself. So what else do we need to monitor? Well, the CloudStack TCP ports that it's using for everything, really. So we have our access ports to the UI and the API, 8080 and the 8443 if you want secure communications. We have 9090, which is used for the communication between the two CloudStack management servers, or more if you have more than, and of course there's port 8250 where the CloudStack agents connect to. You want to make sure these are always up and running, and of course you can do this in Zabbix via just basic TCP checks. Just check if the TCP port is open. More than that, you may want to go further and also look at the availability of the UI and the API. Is it responsive? Is it available? How responsive is it? Is it taking too long to load? Maybe there's a problem and you need to investigate. So, for example, Zabbix has a really nice feature called web scenario, where it actually has the ability to log into your UI and actually do a query, an API query. And there's an example here, probably can't be seen from too afar. It just does list zones, and if it takes more than 3 seconds, it will trigger an alert. Of course, it also keeps track of all the values that it had in time. This is actually from our lab, so you can see which are the more busy periods and so on. So this is a very handy feature to have. Other than that, you want to really look into the Java virtual machine via the JMX connector and monitor your heap memory and other stuff that it exposes, like database connections, concurrent connections, and a lot of other things. They're called beans. I'm not very familiar with Java, but whoever is a programmer, this may make more sense to them. Right, so to monitor the JVM, you would need to use a JMX template, which is supported in Zabbix. Basically, you point it, you tell CloudStack, hey, look, you need to start the remote JMX console. You do this by editing the systemd service file or etc default CloudStack. And CloudStack will start this for you. You can then tell Zabbix, use this template, connect to this JMX console, gather all the metrics, and watch out, do your thing, create your triggers, alerts, and so on. Okay, so this bit is like the core CloudStack stuff, but of course we have our VMs, and monitoring the VMs is can get a little bit tricky. First of all, you may not want to monitor all the VMs. If you're a public cloud provider, you may not be interested in monitoring some dude's virtual machine. But some people may choose to, for example, pay extra for monitoring, and then you need to keep an eye on this machine. Depending on what kind of network you have deployed, what kind of zone you have deployed, it may be easier or harder to monitor these virtual machines. Why? Because if your virtual machine is in an isolated network behind the firewall, behind a NAT, then Zabbix can't reach it. So there are a few tricks that you can use to get metrics about those machines. One of them being you can install a Zabbix agent inside the virtual machine that's in active mode. This means having the virtual machine connect to the Zabbix server instead of the usual way it's the server connecting to the client and exporting the data. But out of the box, for example, if that virtual machine dies and no longer dies, I mean it's whatever, it's kernel panic for some reason or extremely loaded, then it will stop pushing this data. Zabbix by default doesn't do anything, doesn't trigger any alerts. So that virtual machine may well be unusable. And you're oblivious to that fact. You can create triggers and say, look, if the ping from this machine had no data in this amount of time, it means it's having trouble. So you can create triggers based on no data, agent checks, active agent checks. The active being the important bit here because it's the virtual machine sending data to the Zabbix server. Another thing you can do is have a Zabbix proxy. So the Zabbix proxy is like a middleman, as the name implies, between your server and the VM. You can install a Zabbix proxy, also in active mode. So the Zabbix proxy will connect to the Zabbix server, but all the checks will be done passively from the proxy to the virtual machines or all the virtual machines in your network. Probably not a good idea, but you can actually install a Zabbix proxy in the virtual router, so you can use the virtual router to do checks on the virtual machines in that network, and then have all that data, all those metrics, sent back to the Zabbix server. I said it's a bad idea because of the transient nature of the virtual router may get recreated and so on. Perhaps we could make this a feature in the future. Right. So. Probably there's a lot more to be said about monitoring the virtual machines, which this can happen in a lot of weird situations, all sorts of differences based on your setup. So yeah, happy to talk more about this after the talk or at the pub. And right, we were talking about how Zabbix can also use, more modern software such as Prometheus or InfluxDB for data storage. And since version, I think 4.13 or something like this, we have a native Prometheus exporter that Zabbix can interpret and build all sorts of graphs on it. In this example here, we are looking at the CloudStack VMs total, which is a Prometheus metric, and we're looking, we're applying a filter. We're looking at the VMs in error. Also, we have a trigger here. If the number of VMs in error is equal or greater than 1, then we're gonna have an alert. What does this mean? It means CloudStack failed to deploy correctly a virtual machine. So that could indicate usually a serious problem, either a serious misconfiguration or something is failing in your environment. Perhaps it's a network, storage, who knows? It will need to be investigated. So if I would run a public cloud or any sort of cloud, I would be looking at this kind of stuff. Okay, so that's how CloudStack can use the Zabbix can use the Prometheus exported data by the CloudStack exporter. This is just basically scratching the surface because you can create graphs and triggers and items based on all of the data exported by CloudStack. So you can look at, for example, the network traffic that a VM did in a time frame and much more. IOPS, storage, all sorts of stuff. Very handy to have. Prometheus is a time-based series database, and it's quite accurate. But even more accurate than Prometheus is InfluxDB, which, from my understanding, has like nanosecond level. How can I say accuracy? So this can InfluxDB can be used by CloudStack to export the data. So if you go into the global settings in what is that, stats output URI, then you can define location of where your InfluxDB server is running. You specify the database name, and CloudStack will start to push data into it. For example, some of the more interesting data that we see in the VM stats, this is created automatically by CloudStack, is like disk read IOPS, disk write IOPS, network read kilobytes per second, and network write. There are some more. And in this example here, I'm just doing, by the way, the syntax is kind of like SQL. You can do select, disk read, and so on from the table VM stats where the UUID of the VM is that log sausage there, with a limit of 15. Basically, we don't want to, maybe don't want to see all the data. So you can see here loads of read IOPS and so on, network writes, network reads, all very very useful information to have. And of course, as it happens, Zabbix can connect to this database and interpret this data, create graphs. Of course, then you can apply your triggers and so on. So I could really see, perhaps at some point in the future, having our CloudStack usage server replaced by something like this. Why not? I mean, it's an option. Yeah.
That's a question. That stats output.uri global setting, that's been around forever and a day.
That has been around for a long time.
And is that just putting that isn't, you're not specifying that it's going to go into InfluxDB. That's just dumping it somewhere.
No, you have to specify it's InfluxDB. You can also specify it's a graphite. And I'm not sure whether anything else is supported, but these two are certainly supported. So InfluxDB is supported and Graphite is supported.
But there's settings in CloudStack, are they?
This is a setting in CloudStack, yes.
I didn't even know we had that integration.
Yeah, you go.
Years ago. Did you?
Yeah.
Thanks, Guido.
Yes, I think it was Guido for Graphite initially, right?
Yeah, and then for Influx, we use it to do billing for the virtual machines. So you get the VM stats and you get the host stats. So
you've already replaced CloudStack usage with this?
Yeah.
Somewhat, yeah.
Years ago.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, there you go. It's so the option in the global setting is stats.output.uri, URI, and then you have to specify like it would be an HTTP address, influx db colon / and then IP address and then a database name, and just CloudStack will just push all this data into it. Really handy to have, and I think this is probably the most performant solution you can have now. Maybe. I mean, I'm not an expert, but to me it looked really good. All right. Maybe I rushed a bit through it. Perhaps I finished earlier than I should have. Comments or questions?
How does that thing you just showed, where you're pushing things out, relate to the new bit of UI that shows metrics?
Well, I think those are the same metrics being pushed. So CloudStack, I think I'll have to double check. But all this is coming from the stats collector. So in both places, we have the same data as far as I'm aware. So it's the same data. Yeah. Yes?
So that bit you're talking about, the Zabbix using the Prometheus exporter.
Yes.
Is that a specific piece of integration between Zabbix and Prometheus, or is that just an open standard in terms of data?
It's a feature of Zabbix that it is able to read Prometheus exporter in a similar way it's able to read SNMP.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. same for InfluxDB. Oh, and another thing, but maybe I didn't mention, is that actually Grafana also supports Zabbix. So if you're not happy with the dashboards in Zabbix, they're a bit more, let's say, functional rather than sexy. Then you can use Grafana to have very specialized, nice-looking dashboards if you're still working in a network operations center with a lot of fancy TVs on the wall and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucian.
Okay. Thank you.